All right, so I am seeing 201 on my computer here, so I think we can go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar on silvopasture. We got a title, How Silvopasture Improves Animal Well-Being, Ecosystem Health, and Farm Profitability. We're really excited today to have two additional co-hosts from outside organizations. We have CJ Busby and Austin Unruh here. CJ is from Propagate, which is an organization, is a for-profit agroforestry technical assistance provider. They've been doing this. They have over 40 years of collective experience advising on over 30,000 acres of tree planting projects. They help out with pre-planning, planning, design, site preparation, planting, and monitoring. And CJ is going to talk a little bit more about some of the opportunities that Propagate has for farmers. And then we also have Austin Unruh from Trees for Grazers. Trees for Grazers is, again, a organization based in Pennsylvania, working specifically with silvopasture and silvopasture plantings in the area and regionally. We're really excited to have both of these two guys here with us today. They have a lot of experience with silvopasture and are helping us at Rodale develop and implement our research and education program surrounding agroforestry and silvopasture. So my name is Lee Archer. I am the director of our Perennial Systems Research Program at Rodale Institute. My background is in orchard crops and cropping systems, so I'm definitely relying on the experience of people like CJ and Austin to help out with the agroforestry and silvopasture research we're trying to do. And I'm going to pass it off to CJ for the first few slides, and he's going to introduce himself, talk a little bit about what silvopasture is, and then we'll get into a background of some of the projects that the three of our organizations have worked on together.
Thanks, Lee. I just want to thank Rodale and Lee in particular for inviting me to this. This is great. Just a little personal anecdote. I studied ecological agriculture at the University of Vermont, and Rodale is this name that if you've ever studied agriculture at any level, you're bound to come across it. So to be involved as Rodale starts to be more involved in perennial systems research rather, it's really exciting for me. Yeah, so I'm a agroforestry project manager. I work with clients to design and install best fit agroforestry systems for their specific context. I've been doing that for about 2 years. I come from a world of perennial farm management, primarily in vineyards in Vermont. And I was actually able to have a few experiences bringing sheep into vineyards. So that's really what spurred my initial interest into silvopasture.
And let's give Austin a second to introduce himself. And then I also want to do one housekeeping, which is if everyone could please add questions throughout the presentation into the Q&A function of the Zoom webinar. We're going to try to address some of those as they come up. We won't get to all of them, but if you add questions into the Q&A, I'll interrupt some of our speakers and try to ask those as we're going. But Austin, if you want to introduce yourself as well, we don't have your picture up, but.
Thanks, Lee. Well, yes, I'm a late addition here. I wasn't sure I was going to be able to make this, but I was able to move some things around and get the things done in time, so I was able to be here. I'm happy to be able to present on this. So I am Austin Unruh. I run Trees for Grazers. And as Lee said earlier, we're a silvopasture focused company. We do other agroforestry practices as well. We do riparian buffers and all kinds of other things. But silvopasture is really our main focus, where we're looking to help farmers integrate trees, mostly trees that are there to serve their livestock by providing shade, shelter, and feed during critical times of the year. And that's what's brought us to this hog silvopasture demonstration and research site in particular, which we're looking forward to working with Rodale and Propagate on.
Thanks, Austin. All right, we will pass it off to CJ to really dig into some of the details here.
Great, thanks, Lee. So we're here to talk about silvopasture today. That begs the question, what is silvopasture? At a simple level, silvopasture is the deliberate and intensive integration of trees and or shrubs with grazing livestock. We do this for a variety of reasons, and every silvopasture system is going to look a little bit different. And I think it's really important to emphasize that silvopasture is a lot of things, but one thing it is definitely not is prescriptive. So silvopasture can look like this, where we have chickens foraging among elderberries. What this is doing is providing some potential pest control for the elderberries, and it's also providing enhanced foraging opportunities from the invertebrates that may be living on the bushes. And as the bushes mature, it's going to provide a little bit of protective cover for the chickens as well. Silvopasture can also look like this, quite different. This is actually a managed woodland at Angus Glen Farms in Watkins Glen, New York. If you're ever in that area, it's a great place to check out. What you're seeing here is a close to mature canopy of black walnut interspersed with some black locust, with beef cattle happily feeding underneath that. And then near and dear to all of our hearts here, silvopasture can also look like this, where we have a super diverse multi-storied canopy of forage crops to support hog silvopasture. And Lee's going to tell us a lot more about that in a moment. So why would we install silvopasture? The three main reasons come down to the farm and the farmer, meaning their bottom line. So how can we reduce their feed costs by providing forage opportunities for the trees? Are there opportunities for us to provide another income stream via the sale of timber or some other kind of wood product? Or just increasing overall resiliency? I mean, I've lived in Vermont, and the increasingly erratic weather is definitely starting to put a number and a hurting on farmers. So how can we build in inherent resiliency into systems? And then, of course, being that this is an animal-based system, what are the benefits to animals? We'd see reduced stress, more varied nutrition, and a extended forage time. So it's not just cows eating grass in a field all day, it's cows eating grass and then having the opportunity to munch on other little things that may be falling from trees throughout the year. And then critically, silvopasture can have enormous benefits to the environment. We see increased biodiversity in bird species and insect diversity as well. Trees have amazing capacity to reduce runoff, and being trees, they can sequester carbon above ground, and they're also really powerful agents that's sequestering carbon below ground. So let's go through a few examples of these. People might choose to adopt silvopasture just for the benefits of shade. None of us want to sit out in the middle of a hot field and eat. And if we're not eating, we're not going to gain weight. And the reality of a lot of livestock farming is we want animals to put weight on. So providing them with shade can incentivize eating. It keeps the animals more happy and healthy. And that's a really valuable aspect. Trees themselves also have a tangible value. I mean, if it's a high quality tree of a desirable species, that is money standing in the middle of your pasture. So while the tree is capturing sunlight, turning it into woody biomass, it's also providing shade. And then at some point you have a harvestable product to sell into the market. And then again, I mentioned in Vermont, we've been dealing with a lot of flooding issues. So this one's particularly top of mind for me. And trees have enormous capacity at reducing erosion from heavy rain events. They do this through deep perennial roots that hold the soil together, that also have the added benefit of capturing carbon, phosphorus, other nutrient runoff. And they're also much more effective than grass-only buffers at cooling these small streams that wind their way through our agricultural fields before they get to much larger water bodies that are harder to cool down, that would then drain into lakes or the ocean and lead to eutrophication and all the negative things we hear about with agricultural runoff. And then really important, just as carbon becomes a much larger part of the conversation around agriculture and our lifestyles in general, frankly, silvopasture can be a really useful tool in building carbon capture potential in our soils and agricultural systems. I've already mentioned that they capture carbon above ground, but when managed well with rotational grazing, and that is really a key aspect of a good silvopasture system, there's a much higher potential to put carbon into the soil than we'd see in conventionally managed pasture, or certainly conventionally managed cropping systems. So I'm going to pass it back to Lee now that we kind of have a baseline of what silvopasture is, what the benefits are, to talk about what silvopasture looks like at Rodale.
Thanks, CJ. Yeah, we're going to take a little bit of a step back here to make sure that we're all on the same page for what we have going on at Rodale. So I'm going to just give a quick overview. This is not focused on our organic pastured hog facility. This whole talk isn't focused on that, but I want to make sure everyone is aware of what we have in terms of tools and resources at our disposal. So at Rodale Institute, we have a state-of-the-art hog facility for pastured organic hog production. It was built in 2015, and the goal of building this entire facility was to reduce labor and input costs. If you check back on some of our older webinars on our website, we have some great webinars about what our hog facility, how it was designed, and what are the benefits of it. But essentially, it's a centralized building, and then there's 8 acres of surrounding pasture that the pigs have 24/7 access to. So the goal of developing this facility was to improve animal welfare and reduce feeding costs. If you could go to the next slide, CJ. The purpose of Rodale is to do education, but also research on the different ways in which we can promote organic agriculture. So our organic pastured pork research program focuses on a bunch of different questions. We've had a bunch of different research projects out there. Some of them have been on paddock size and the type of pasture that we need, practices for maximizing regrowth. Parasites are a big project that we have going on right now, how we can manage parasites in organic hogs, the nutritional composition of the pasture, and then the hog weight gain relative to the pasture and paddock size. So with this research program, what we have been seeing, what we've been learning from people like CJ and Austin is that silvopasture might be the best direction for us to head in order to develop a more regenerative hog pastured pork system. And so we partnered with Propagate Ag, we partnered with Trees for Grazers to try to figure out how we can develop our pastured pork research program into a silvopasture system. So on the next slide here, what we were able to do is we were able to get some funding from an organization called the Edwards Mother Earth Foundation to establish a demonstration silvopasture site at our main campus in Kutztown, Pennsylvania. The goal of this was to give shade and fodder to the animals, but also to develop this into a research project. You can see here some of the species that we have planted in there. And I'm wondering, I'm going to put Austin on the spot here, if he, being a Pennsylvania native, would be able to take a second to discuss why we chose some of these species, what you see as maybe the best options for hogs in the area, and anything else you have to say about specifics about those species.
Yeah, absolutely. So for a hog silvopasture system, there's 2 main goals. So one is to provide shade for the livestock, because shade will increase the weight gain efficiency. It will increase the animal welfare for the hogs on pasture. Like if you're going to have hogs in a pastured pig operation, you might as well have shade for those, because they will do better underneath those conditions. And if you're going to plant trees for shade, let's plant trees that are also going to drop feed for those hogs, because hogs are not ruminant animals. They are not designed to gain all of their weight off of pasture. Pasture can be a good supplement, but it's not. They're not cows. They're not goats. They're not sheep. They want feed that is high in energy, much easier to digest than pasture and forages. So that's where integrating trees for the feed really comes in, and has the opportunity to provide really significant benefits to hogs and to pastured pig operations, and then also pastured poultry operations are similar. And when I come to wanting to integrate trees for hogs, the #1 tree that I look at is mulberry. It's really almost anywhere in the United States, mulberry is going to be your #1 tree option for hog silvopasture, because it's a high quality feed, high in protein actually for a fruit. We got some tests back recently where they were testing at 12 to 18% protein for the fruit itself. And then it just yields a lot of fruit. It's very easy to work with. Mulberries grow so well. They just want to grow, they want to live. So we use a lot of mulberry for hog silvopasture systems. They also drop in a time of year when a lot of things are not dropping. So they're dropping in June, July, August, and later on in the year, like September, October, you have a whole bunch of other things like your apples, your oaks, your hazelnuts, your chestnuts are dropping in that time frame, and there really isn't much that drops in that early summer time frame. So mulberry is a very, very handy species for hog silvopasture. And then you want to round that out. You don't want to have just mulberry, because you want to have drop at different times of the year. So that's where apples come in great. You can have apples dropping as early as June, and then hanging onto the tree in December or even later, depending on what cultivars you're choosing. Oaks are a great one. It's a very traditional species for using with hogs. Acorn finished hogs have been around since people have been raising hogs. And then hazelnuts are a fantastic option. One that, like, if you think of planting an oak and as feed, it's going to take a long time for that to yield you a crop, right? Whereas hazelnuts are a nut crop that can yield you a crop very quickly relative to oaks or even chestnuts. Persimmons are right up there with mulberry as another tree that makes a lot of sense, and it can drop from, depending on the cultivar, from as early as August or so all the way into winter. Honey locust is one that we typically think of more for ruminants, for our cattle, for our sheep, but hogs will eat them too. They're high in energy. They don't have much protein or fat, but they are high in energy. Chestnuts are a great one as well. A lot of calories there, a lot of energy in chestnuts, and they produce well. And then poplars they're fantastic for getting quick shade out there. So if you want to get trees established and you want to reduce the heat stress on your livestock, getting like hybrid poplars in there for quick shade, and then for the timber revenue as well as an option, whether it's a general hybrid poplar that's more of a pulpwood, or it's a nicer poplar like a curly poplar that Propagate works with, that is more of a veneer type timber. Those are both good options.
Thanks, Austin. So before we jump into some of our research objectives surrounding the Silvopasture demonstration site, I want to ask a quick question from the Q&A for both CJ and Austin to address if you have an answer for it. But basically, why would a farmer not want to do this? So what considerations does a farmer need to weigh in terms of pros and cons, and what are the biggest challenges associated with Silvopasture? I know we'll talk about some of these later, but just kind of the broad overview here as we really went into the great parts of Silvopasture.
That's a fantastic question, because like we're telling you all these amazing things the trees do. It's the logical next step is, well, then why isn't everyone doing this? Mm-hmm. One is it's not cheap to put trees in the ground, and to do it right, especially, which we're going to talk about the critical importance of that. It's not cheap. Quality trees are not cheap either. And for a lot of farmers, it just adds another level of complexity to their systems. And, you know, you don't want to just stick something in the ground and walk away. Like there are management needs that any of these require, even though it's a spectrum across these. Sometimes it's just a little bit of there's a mental jump from I have a pasture, it's very simple, I can see what everything's going on, to now I have trees in it, it interferes with how you operate equipment. And Austin, I'd love to hear your answer. I'm sure we share some of the same opinions on this, but.
Yep, absolutely. It's a very permanent thing, right? Planting trees in a pasture, it's a long-term commitment. So you want to make sure that you're going to do it well, and design the system right. You don't want just any old trees in there that are kind of just taking up space. You want to have the right genetics. You want to have the right like economic returns. And like you were saying, it's not cheap. And the thing, to me, I think the biggest thing there is it's an investment that will be profitable. I'm very confident that a silvopasture system can be designed to be very profitable, but it's profitable in the long term. And so it's that cash flow that is harder for people to overcome, because you're making a fairly significant investment that's not going to return you any money for, let's say, 5 years for something that's dropping fodder. So that's probably the main hang up for most folks. And so finding resources through which to offset that initial investment costs is really valuable. And then just beyond that too, like if someone has a permanent pasture and they're raising pigs, I don't really see much reason to not put trees in there. But if you're in a system where you might not want the trees there in 10 years or 20 years, you might want it to be crops again. That's a situation where it just might not make sense there. And when you do your design, you want to design your system such that it can work with within the context that might change over time. So maybe you have them wider space so that you could still crop in between if that's part of your management system. So a lot of the reasons to not do it can be worked with based on how you design a system like this. And we always recommend to folks start off small so that you get your experience with this and you get hands-on experience with it. And later on, you can then decide to scale up and then expand this on your site once you have confidence that this is what you want and this is indeed going to fit within your farming system.
Perfect. So with that, we talked a little bit about the benefits in terms of shade and fodder, but I do want to mention that one of the objectives here of this installation was the research aspect of it. So Jake asked a question in the chat about whether there's a publicly available economic model that accounts for the benefits resulting from the increased shade and fodder and eating. And I'm going to take a stab and say that this is going to be a very site-specific data point, and that yes, there are some great researchers doing this work already, but we need to expand that research to other locations and other places. And so that's the reason that we're tackling this whole program. And so I'm going to introduce April here. April is an intern right now at the Rodale Institute, and she, for her intern project, has developed a proposal for us to answer some of the very questions that are being asked here. And so April has been with us since about May. She's coming directly from graduating from Skidmore College and has been instrumental in developing this proposal for us to establish a research program surrounding some of the silvopasture plantings we have. So April, take it away. Make sure you're not on mute.
Hi, everyone. I'm April, as Lee mentioned. Thank you for the introduction. So this summer I created kind of this proposal with Lee looking at how do you optimize kind of those 3 pillars of silvopasture being soil, tree, and animal health in a hog silvopasture system specifically as compared to a pasture system. And I think this is a really important question to address, as a lot of silvopasture systems have currently been implemented with grazing ruminants, as was mentioned before. So in our research, we kind of broke that down into 3 different objectives, addressing soil health, tree health, and hog health. And so looking into how hog silvopasture compared to just regular hog pasturing impacts soil health, we would look at the nutrients that are in the soil through collecting soil samples within an apple orchard specifically. We'd be looking at soil compaction, percent of bare soil within a row specifically of the apple orchard. We'd be looking at the presence and nature of hog trails, so how those hogs are kind of disturbing that surface forage. And additionally, we'd be looking at runoff, so how that compaction maybe impacts the water infiltration rate within a specific row of the orchard. And additionally, how the hogs would be kind of uprooting the soil and excavating the soil with their natural rooting behaviors. And then for that second objective, we would be focusing more on the tree health pillar of silvopasturing, looking at if the hogs were debarking trees, looking at the impact of hog rotational grazing on excavating and debarking roots, and additionally looking at how the hogs grazing that specific row of the orchard versus the pasture was impacting the understory, the presence of dead trees, and additionally we'd be looking at leaf nutrients within each row. And lastly, the last pillar we'd be addressing is kind of looking at how hog rotationally grazing in a silvopasture would impact hog health. So over the course of the trial, we'd be looking at the weight gain from before the hogs were implemented or put into the rotational silvopasture and the pasture. We'd be looking at their initial weight and their final weight. We'd be looking at the supplemental feed, which is consumed by the hogs in both the pasture versus the silvopasture. We'd be looking at the feed efficiency, which kind of measures the amount of supplemental feed that gets converted to pounds gained within each hog. And more looking at the animal well-being side of things, we would be taking saliva cortisol concentration samples from the hogs before and after the trial to see kind of get more into that stress level and see what the silvopasture has an impact on that, and the shade provision and all of that, how that impacts hog health. And lastly, we'd be taking weekly behavioral measurements, looking at sort of the prosocial and antisocial behaviors of the hogs within the silvopasture versus the pasture, and seeing if we see any differences there as well.
Thanks, April. Yeah, so thank you for talking about some of our future research that we're hoping to accomplish with this new silvopasture site that we have. I want to move forward by talking about a little bit about how we actually went about doing this. So this was definitely a group project, a group activity. We at Rodale have a great history of organic production, but silvopasture is something that we're just delving into. So relying on the expertise of Propagate and Trees for Grazers to make this project really come to life is what made it possible for us. So I just wanted to point out that each of us played a sort of our own role in this, but we all worked very collaboratively on each of the steps that we need to take. And we're going to step through basically how we go from the very beginning of the stages to the end. CJ is going to talk about this a little bit as we move on. If you go to the next slide here, I wanted to just show how we actually went about putting trees in the ground. And right now, a lot of silvopasture systems, we are developing, there are tools that are being developed that are going to make this less of a hand labor type job, but having a lot of people really excited about this, we were able to bring in volunteers, interns, and students to help with actually planting trees in the ground. And I think that's a great way to build connection and build community. People love planting trees more than they love planting, I don't know, grains or something. So we were able to get this system planted this past spring. You'll notice that we planted with what are called tree tubes. This is a method that we're using to protect the trees from animals and also to promote the upward and straight growth of the trees from the very beginning. So these are just some images of our site actually going in. This is at our main campus in Kutztown. So if you come by in the next few months to the next few years, you will see these plastic tree tubes, but know that there is a tree living within that. And so it'll look really cool in a few years. So in terms of what we've learned so far from this project, the first, as I mentioned, is that cooperation and taking the strengths of each organization and working together on this is really critical. And then we're going to talk about each of these other sort of challenges that we've experienced. I think CJ is going to touch on some of them and Austin can probably chime in. But the nursery supply can be a bit of a bottleneck. Tree protection is definitely a big problem if you're introducing animals right away. And that the point I want to make with this is that we're doing this research so that we can make some mistakes so that you and farmers can hopefully not make the same mistakes. Our income doesn't depend on the success of our silvopasture. We're a research organization. And so we're here to make some mistakes and we're here to learn from them. So I think I'm going to pass it back to CJ to talk a little bit about his how his organization goes about helping farmers design these types of systems and get them implemented in the ground.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, so at this point, we've talked about what silvopasture is. We've gone through some of the benefits. We've looked at what the process of putting an actual silvopasture installation in the ground looks like. I think the next logical step is to talk about how we go about designing these. I know I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar that every system is going to be highly curtailed to the specific context, to the farm, to the animals that are involved. Obviously, that adds a level of complication But I think that there's ways that we can break it down and make it a little less overwhelming and really help us hone in on what our options are for the kind of trees and shrubs we're going to be planting and where we're going to be planting them. So the first thing, as Austin and I both mentioned a few times now, the main things you're thinking about with silvopasture are production of fodder, so things that animals can actually eat, and production of shade, so keeping the animals protected from the sun. Of course, there's a lot of crossover here, and I think well-designed systems include both of these if possible. It's not always going to be possible, but if you have a tree that can provide fodder and shade, that's the logical choice. Beyond that, there's definitely other drivers for adopting silvopasture. That can be production of timber, so something I touched on earlier, like having an actual sellable piece of wood to sell out of the installation. You may be motivated to grow your own fence posts to be able to expand your pastures. That's something we definitely hear a lot of interest in. Or you could be interested in growing your own substrate for mushroom production. And you also could just be interested in protecting sensitive riparian areas around your farm. So I like to think about, any kind of agroforestry design process, you don't want to pick a tree and then make the system work for that tree. There's inevitably going to be friction there. What you want to do is think about, what are my limiting factors? What equipment do I have? What animals do I have? What kind of time do I have to be managing what is really a new crop on your farm? Like the tree is going to require some care. And then letting that narrative tell you what tree species to plant. That's just there's certain things we can't change. And one of the main ones is climate. Aside from the fact that at a macro level, we as a species are changing the climate, there's very little we can do to change our individual microclimates. So for example, if you're in northern Maine, there's certain things you just can't plant successfully that you'd otherwise be able to grow in Georgia. So that's really your hard limiting factor, is fitting your tree selections into the USDA plant hardiness. I'm sure everyone's familiar with that tool, but I'm constantly referencing it, so I would be remiss if I didn't mention it. Another thing that's very hard to change outside of additions to organic matter and slight changes in pH and addition of some micro and macronutrients is your soil. So having a really solid understanding of what your soils look like, where are there little nuances, can be really important. And there's a lot of tools that can help us do that. Web Soil Survey is the public version. Anyone has access to it. It's extremely powerful. And this is actually a screenshot of our app Overyield. So this is a program that Propagate has spent many years designing and taking input from farmers, other active users, and getting it back into the system. And what we're looking at here is a suitability index for hybrid poplar on a real farm in Vermont. So what the system is doing here is aggregating soil data. It's taking in climate zones and a number of other indices, and it's showing us where on this farm is actually suitable for hybrid poplar, and where are there areas that are actually quite ideal for it, and where are there areas that are no-goes. So I think that this can be a really powerful tool. We're happy to talk about it and see if it's something that's valuable for folks considering silvopasture adoption. And then, so once we start thinking about what our hard limiting factors we want to talk about what are the animals that are going to be in the system and how can we maximize forage production for them. This is not prescriptive. There's little nuances here. And I do just want to call out that everyone will have access to this presentation and to some of this documentation. So don't feel like you need to take notes about everything you're seeing here. But it's just to give you an idea that there's a lot of creativity and room for optimization in this design. So if you had cows and pigs, you're going to have a different system than if you have sheep and goats. And I also touch a little bit on that there's the key difference with a lot of these animals is that ruminants can effectively digest grass, and pigs actually need to be eating, more fruits and nuts and things like that. So this is a graphic of the forage timing for the silvopasture system at Rodale. Again, there was our primary goal was to maximize the amount of forage throughout the season. So as Austin mentioned, we have things like mulberry coming in earlier. And then as that starts to taper off, we get into these hard massed nuts and apples and things that'll really help the animals gain a lot of weight going into the winter when we want to see them in really prime condition. And then if you're just selecting for shade, because that's a totally valid thing to do and it does happen, it's going to be a slightly different suite of species. And in some ways, that simplifies things. So you may be motivated to just have things that grow fast, like Austin mentioned with hybrid poplar. It can establish very quickly. So you could basically have instant shade within a couple of years in your pasture. Or you might be looking at more longer term investment things like black locust and black walnut. One thing I really do want to call out on the slide, we typically think about trees buffering the negative effects of extreme weather in relation to the sun and heat, but it's also important to realize that really dense conifers are very effective at being a windbreak. So you can imagine a system where if you have pastured animals in the winter, it is effectively a windbreak, a wall of coniferous trees could buffer them from cold winds as well, which actually also helps animals gain weight because they're not using, their metabolism doesn't have to run as high to stay warm. So how do we go about we know what trees we want, we know what our goals are, we've thought through all of that. A really daunting step can be, how do I lay this out on my farm? If I'm not the one planting it, how do I show the person who is planting it where the trees need to go? Again, this is something we see a lot of value in with our program Overyield, where we can look at a satellite image, we can draw polygons, assign different crop mixes, different cultivars, really nuanced economic data into the program. And then we can take all of that information that corresponds to the polygons you see in the middle and the tree species you see on the right. And we can actually get them into GPS guidance systems that tell a tractor where to go and where the trees are going to go. So what you're seeing here is our field manager, Bob. He is steering, although the tractor is actually in a lot of ways steering itself in this image. And the unit is spraying a little point that is directly correlated to a GPS point out of Overyield. And that point is going to say, there's a tree that goes here, and that corresponds to a map that's also an output of Overyield or any other management program that you're using. I think the key here is that you don't want to just go out with a pile of trees and stick them in the ground. You want to go out with a plan. And there's a lot of people that can assist with that plan and make sure you end up with a really solid result. So as we talk about field prep, I just want to pause here and talk about it. It's a huge investment to put a tree in the ground, and you really want to do it right the first time, because a tree that goes into weedy, compacted soil is just not going to establish as quickly, and you're going to see a slower economic return on that investment. So what we advocate is for, at bare minimum, doing subsoiling to relieve that compaction, doing some kind of primary tillage to break up the initial competition if it's in a pasture setting, and then seeding down whatever forage mix or single species forage that you want to see that's going to be growing along with the trees. That's also an opportunity to plant something that's not going to overly compete with the trees when they're very young. So it's just another lever you can pull with the design and implementation. So let's start to look at a few examples from around the world of what these systems can look like. This is a farm in Argentina. What we see here are poplars and alfalfa growing in the alleys, excuse me. So this is actually kind of a mix of alley cropping that will turn into silvopasture. And the reason they're doing this is to be able to pull something harvestable out that they can still feed to their animals while the trees are at an age that they might be susceptible to rubbing from the beef cattle. So you can see they've actually cut the hay and they've laid it out in windrows, and that'll eventually get baled and they'll be able to feed that.
So CJ, this is a farm in Argentina, you said. Does Propagate have the capacity to support farmers internationally or in other places? I've seen in the chat that we have a couple of people from outside the US even.
Fantastic. Yeah, we work with folks at least at a software level and with some technical assistance that are from all over the world. And that's a really cool thing about my job, frankly, is I get to see how people are designing somewhat similar and in a lot of ways quite different systems depending on where they're located across the world. So yeah, we absolutely have users based in Europe. We have users based in South America, Australia, and Hawaii. I know it's still within our country, but quite different climatic context.
Awesome. Thanks, CJ.
Mm-hmm. So this is the same farm 4 years later. So we can see the poplars have matured. They're no longer at a point that the cows can cause any real harm to them. And this is when you'd also start to see some shading on the alfalfa. So that makes that less productive. And it's a really ideal time to actually introduce the animals into the system. This is the same farm again, albeit in a much lusher state. They also graze sheep underneath their citrus orchard. So again, it can look like a lot of different things. And this is that same photo from Angus Glen Farm in Watkins Glen, New York. This is ultimately what the end result of silvopasture could look like, where you have a mature canopy, and you've been able to maintain grass growing underneath that provides really valuable forage. And yeah.
I want to touch on this. There's been a couple of questions in the Q&A and chat about the idea of additive versus maybe subtractive silvopasture. So are there any concerns that you and maybe Austin, you can touch on this as well, about the idea of introducing animals into an existing forest? And do you have any sort of recommendations for how to best go about doing that? Do you support that in terms of the design and implementation?
We at this point don't have staff where we can provide the technical assistance, but we do have good folks, good forester friends that we can refer people to, who can support people in the thinning of woods to create silvopasture. It is a whole other skill set to do that really well. You need someone who's very knowledgeable about forestry, livestock, and forages, and there's not a whole lot of people that fit all those three categories. This picture right here is of Brett Chedzoy and his farm, and he is a great example of someone who is a professional forester, but he also raises livestock on this family farm that has been in the family for years. So he's very well versed in each one of those categories. But thinning a woods, thinning silvopasture is a great way to do it, especially if you have like a junky woods. It's been all the best timber has been taken away for years and years, and so all you have left is kind of the crappiest trees that are remaining, or it's something that has regrown, or it's an old monoculture pine plantation. There's lots of instances where it makes a lot of sense to come in and thin those trees out and establish forages and bring your livestock in. We obviously don't want to just run livestock loose in the woods, especially if we don't have adequate forages and they're not being fed adequately. But there's a lot of upside to a well-designed silvopasture system where we're thinning. But one of the key things that I would say is absolutely get someone in there who can advise you on the process, because just as planting trees is like a one-time thing, and once you plant the tree, it's there permanently. But I think of the thinning is even more like permanent, or it's even more kind of dramatic and drastic, because you're coming in there with chainsaws and heavy equipment, and once you cut the tree, you can't put that tree back. Like once you plant a tree, you could move it yet, or you could decide you don't want it there. But once you cut a tree down, it is gone. So having someone with thoughtfulness and with experience who can come in and advise you through that process is highly recommended.
Anything to add to that, CJ, in terms of like concerns or other things you need to be thinking about?
I'm couldn't have said it better than what Austin said. I'll just echo it. There's a whole suite of other considerations. If you have a woodland that may have, I mean, I see this a lot in Vermont, where you have people who want to convert something into silvopasture by removal, but they have really sensitive native plants growing in that understory. It's probably not going to happen. There's just a whole different suite of things to be concerned about, but there are really well done examples of it. And it can end up looking beautiful like this. And I mean, this is a prime example.
CJ, I'm just going to throw out there like a story or two to really highlight the value of having someone come in and help you through this process. I was in New York, actually not too far from you, CJ, last winter, and I was able to visit this farm that had this big thinning done, and they thinned it really hard. Probably 80–90% of the trees were gone. And because of that, the remaining trees were very susceptible to wind damage. And so let's say they took out 80% of the trees, and then half of the remaining trees, the tops broke out or whatever in subsequent storms. And so they had this landscape where they still had some trees, but they weren't great trees. They weren't in great shape. They had been really under stress. A lot of the trees that they had left are now down or broken. And so they now have this scenario where it's not a great silvopasture and it's not a woods, and they probably would have to come through and just take out the remaining trees and replant stuff. But they don't have enough remaining trees for it to be economically viable for a forester or a logger to come in a second time. So they would end up having to pay a lot more out of pocket to do it, to take out the remaining trees. And that's something that could have been avoided with a really good plan with someone who has experience in this.
Thanks, Austin. Thanks, CJ.
All right, so Austin and I both touched on this, but it's not as simple as just sticking a tree in the ground and then in 10, 20, however many years you have silvopasture. There's ongoing things that need to be happening while it's establishing. You're going to have to be thinking about it. Again, there's certain things that will take a lot less thought and a lot less time, and there's other things that are a lot more involved. Rotational grazing is key with any grazing system, and silvopasture is no different. And honestly, once you start putting trees into a pasture, you further concentrate animal activity, because they're going to want to gravitate towards where the shade is or where the fodder is. So it just adds another level. You need to be thinking about that and making sure you have a really solid grazing plan, if you have the density and the amount of acreage that would necessitate that. If you live in areas that don't get a lot of rain in the summer, or if you have really hot summers, while the trees are establishing, you certainly want to be thinking about irrigation. Do you have the potential to go out and give them a little bit of water if you're not seeing the rains you need? We all hope that we have the perfect amount of rain in a growing season, but that very rarely happens. And then one thing that we're going to spend a few minutes talking about is, how do we pay for these programs and these installations? We've talked about how the amount of money you put in is really an investment, and it's correlated with the returns you get out of it from shade, fodder production, environmental benefits. So the good news is there's a lot of funding out there. It's kind of tied into some bad news, because there's so much funding out there that it could be a little overwhelming to sift through. I would encourage anyone that's interested to reach out. We're happy to have those conversations and try to help farms find money to get trees in the ground to expand silvopasture. I just want to call a few of these out. There's the Expanding Agroforestry Project, administered through the Nature Conservancy. That's available at a more or less a national level, unless you're in the arid West. Of course, the NRCS has a lot of programs that fund planting trees in agricultural settings, so does SARE. because this is a Rodale talk and Rodale's based in Pennsylvania, I also want to call special attention to PASA. They do a lot of fantastic work in catalyzing silvopasture adoption in Pennsylvania and frankly regionally. But again, this is far from an exhaustive list of options, and there's a really big conversation to be had, and we're happy to have that. Just talk a little bit more about what we do at Propagate, as Lee covered a lot of this in the introduction, but we work with farmers on all aspects of agroforestry design and installation, from site visits, site analysis, to planning out the farm design, to work to handling the planting, whether we're handling it in-house or we're working with one of our partners like Austin to get those trees in the ground. And then, as I just mentioned, we can absolutely help with finding financing, whether that's public or private. This is mostly where we operate, again, east of the Rockies. We have most of our presence is in New York. I'm very happy to say we have a lot of projects in Pennsylvania. I love working with the folks in Pennsylvania, so it's a great aspect of my job. And we have a growing presence in Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. So how do we get started? I certainly hope we piqued some interest in silvopasture. I hope we filled in some information gaps that folks might have had. There's demonstration sites that people can visit. If you get in touch with me, I'm happy to send you a list of farmers that might be willing to walk around with you and show you what silvopasture looks like on their farm. I know Austin would probably say the same. If you reach out, I'm happy to send you any other resources. There's all sorts of cited research that would be far too dense to go into in an hour-long webinar. So we'll save that for smaller group conversations. And I really do want to call out, we're having a field day the weekend of September 6th to the 9th in Trumansburg, New York, which is just north of Ithaca. I understand there's some site visits being organized, so you may even get to visit some of these farms you've seen photos of. And again, thanks everyone for joining. It's really exciting getting to talk about silvopasture, especially getting to talk about silvopasture in the company of Austin and Lee and April. Thanks, Rodale. And yeah, I think we have a few minutes for questions, and I'll let anyone else say any closing remarks as well.
Yeah, thanks, CJ. Thanks, Austin. Thanks, CJ. Thanks, April, for all contributing to this. There's a couple of questions that maybe we could touch back on that went through the Q&A. The first one being about, let me find it. Well, I'll go to this one from Julian. Is there any evidence, and maybe I can answer this one in that I'm the one who should be doing more of the background research, but is there evidence of tree growth being accelerated in silvopasture systems due to the animals or grasses growing in the understory compared to non-silvopasture systems? Have you guys seen any recent articles that that demonstrate this or that prove this?
I can't say that I have. That's a really interesting point, though, and that's certainly something that I would love to see continued research on.
Agreed.
The one thing I'll say is that if you have, let's say, something like a mulberry in a poultry silvopasture system near a poultry house and it's getting a lot of manure, then they grow really fast. There's a lot of fertility that's getting those trees going. But in general, I can't say that I've observed trees growing any faster in a silvopasture system. One thing to note here is that having fast growth is good in a way, but also can cause some troubles, cause some stressors to the trees. So part of what we do on all of our sites is we want to manage for the right kind of growth, and we want to, like, the tree tubes have their downsides. They can rub on the trees and they can cause trees to be like tall and floppy and not well balanced. And so they're kind of a necessary evil for most of our sites. We use the tree tubes for a reason, to protect the trees from livestock while they're young and vulnerable, but they do tend to get young and floppy and they can rub on the tubes. So then part of the maintenance protocol is to take care of those trees and reduce the rubbing maybe prune the trees in such a way that they're not as top heavy. So those are some of the complexities that come along with these programs or these designs where you need to use a tree tube to protect the tree from livestock in those early years.
That's a perfect segue into a question that just came up about protection. So there's a question: is there hot wire or other protection methods to protect the tubes? And I think adding on to that question, how long, CJ and Austin, are we recommending keeping the tree tubes on the trees? How long until the animals are allowed into them, or what are your recommendations there?
Yeah, I can take that. So the basis of the tree protection methods that we use are a plantra tree tube. So plantra is the manufacturer of these tree shelters. There's a plastic tube and a fiberglass stake. The nice thing about those is they're flexible and they are electrical insulators. So you can run electric fencing along those tree tubes and use the tube as the post that's holding the electric fencing up. One thing that we've developed that's really nice is punching a hole in the top of the tube and running a poly wire at the top of the tube from all the way down the row from tube to tube. And then you have the option of wrapping an aluminum wire around the tube so that the whole tube is electrified, but livestock are still able to cross in between the rows of trees. And that's turned out to be really nice. Works well for cattle. It would work really well for sheep and for hogs. So that's a good option that we've developed. And then in terms of how long those tubes should stay on, it really depends on the livestock type. So for cattle, we're leaving them on. We're now in the fifth growing season for our oldest sites, and we still have most of our tree tubes on there on those sites. Because we do want, even though the tree is above browse height, there's still the dangers of girdling, like cattle stripping the bark, the rubbing. And one of the challenges too is if you have trees, let's say a black locust tree that's plenty large and is able to stand up to cattle without the tube, you might have a slower growing persimmon tree next to it that needs another 3 or 4 or 5 years of protection. And so oftentimes if you remove the tree tubes off of some trees, you're not able to, you need the tree tubes on there in order for the electric fencing to stay insulated. And so you end up having to have the tree tubes on there for longer than you would need to for some trees so that the younger trees continue to have the protection that they need.
CJ, do you have any, are there any sort of guidelines that you guys follow for any length of time to keep the tubes on, or same as what Austin said?
More or less exactly what Austin said. Yeah, I mean, I think the expectation a lot of people have when we put tree tubes on is, oh, this is just going to be on here for a year or two. But no, it's really 5 to 7 years minimum. You want to get the value out of them. And there's a lot that can go wrong once you take a tree tube off. So you want to make sure that that tree is at its peak performance that could really possibly fit within that tube before you're forced to take it off. And one thing I will add, when you take it off, it is definitely best to take it off in the winter, because that gives time for the bark to actually build up resistance to UV light that it has otherwise not really been forced to develop because it's been protected by that opaque plastic.
Awesome. Thanks, CJ. So there's a couple of questions in the chat that I'm going to sort of sum up into one. But where do you guys recommend going for more information on both specific tree types, the specific costs that someone's going to incur, and the specifics about sourcing and availability? What is your kind of top recommendation for where to get all of this information, or where to go to next?
I would say reach out to us and start a conversation. Within our network, speaking for Austin and I, like we have a lot of connections. We work on these projects frequently, so we really have our finger on the pulse of what trees cost, where we can get them, what might be suitable for your site. There's a lot of resources out there though that can help you kind of steer that. And if you just have general curiosity, those resources can be really useful. Austin, do you want to add anything there?
Sure. We have a lot of resources, very silvopasture focused resources on our website, treesforgrazers.com. All kinds of stuff that if you want to get into the nitty gritty and into depth on silvopasture, there's a lot of stuff there.
All right, thank you. We can keep going for maybe another minute or two here. There's a bunch of questions about other locations, semi-arid, fire-prone, Canada. And I know CJ mentioned it before, you guys have design capacity in other places. What do you guys recommend for those people who are not in the Northeast or in an area with plenty of water? Any capacity out there?
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess I'll just say that a lot of what we talked about certainly still applies in more arid regions. It's just the barrier of establishment is significantly more difficult if you're in California versus if you're in Pennsylvania. Like there's just hard realities about the amount of precipitation. That being said, there are absolutely examples of silvopasture in Northern California where you have oak trees and there's people who run pigs underneath those. So it's not exclusive to the temperate East. I mean, and I think if you think about what's happening in Europe, where you have, relatively arid Mediterranean climates, you see a lot of really like thousands of year old examples of silvopasture there. But yeah, I mean, certainly our program can help work through some of those issues. I also will say that there's an increased use of ruminants, in particular, like goats, in thinning out overgrown woodlands in the West to help bring down that wildfire pressure. You could imagine some kind of system with silvopasture by removal where you're establishing a more healthy balance of grazing animals with a mature canopy without having all the fire-prone thick brush underneath.
Thank you, CJ. One quick question, CJ, where do they sign up for the Ithaca Farm Tours?
That's a great question. That should be coming out shortly. I would say watch on our various social media outlets on LinkedIn or on Instagram. I will absolutely get that'll be well published information. So no one's gonna miss that.
Thanks, CJ. And then there's a couple more questions here about the idea that we're using plastic tree tubes, and Austin gave a great answer to that in the Q&A session. In terms of options for alternatives besides plastic, right now we're using the plastic tree tubes because we see those as the ones that are the most available and work the best for us at the moment. Someone here mentioned that they're using cactus guards and metal cages. What are your guys? Why are we still using plastic? No one here wants to be using plastic, but why do we still find that that's the most effective way for us to go right now?
Yeah, we would love to get away from the plastic. Absolutely love to get away from that. But at this point, the plastic tree tubes just are so effective and have so many upsides. What I don't like about cages, and I've tested, like I've bought metal tree guards with like spikes on them, all kinds of crazy spikes on them. I have also manufactured them myself to try to get them at a lower price and something that I could more easily bring to farms. And I've completely given up on those because it is an absolute pain to manage and maintain trees inside of a cage. They always want to grow outside of the cage, and they want to like grow into the holes in the cage. And so you need to do a lot of pruning. Livestock to get a cage that's 6 foot tall that cattle actually can't browse that's a whole other challenge. And it's tough to get inside to weed and to do any maintenance on the trees. And we find that the plastic tree tubes they're easier to protect, they're cheaper, they're easier to do maintenance on the trees. And with that electric fencing, we're able to protect them very well. And so whether like to do an $8 tree tube or a $25 metal cage that is 3 times as much labor to install, I just haven't, and it's not as handy for maintenance afterwards. We just haven't found anything that's nearly as useful as those plastic tree tubes with electric.
Yeah, and it's a great question, and I'll echo that. Nobody wants to be putting more plastic into into production, really. We'd love to be able to move away from it, but they're undeniably effective, even if there are minor nuances with tree tubes you have to be aware of. But Austin just touched on all the benefits compared to other things. But I will just add, if you're talking about planting, let's say you're planting 1,000 trees, even 1,000 tree tubes is it's a lot, but it's a very manageable unit size and weight to think about. If you start talking about 1,000 metal tree guards, it gets into, you're just talking about enormous weights, and it makes the feasibility of large scale project implementation just that much more difficult. But great question.
Thanks, CJ. I think the last question I want to ask, we do have to wrap up here, is are you guys willing to share either your email or LinkedIn profile name, whatever it is, in maybe the chat box? Is that the best way to contact you, or do you have another way to contact? CJ, do you want people to send you emails? Would it be better for them to send them to someone else?
I would say just if you have particular interest in getting in touch with Propagate, I would just reach out to our inbound form on our website. But yeah, I mean, my email is cj@propagateag.com. So if you have a particular question about Silvopasture that you want to ask me directly, I'm happy to answer that.
And that's just propagate.com or propagate?
Propagateag.com.
Propagateag.com. There it is. Thanks, Kyle. All right, well, I want to thank everyone for sticking it out and staying with us. We're a few minutes over already, and I appreciate everyone's questions and interests. We're really excited that we're able to work on this, and I've said it in the chat a few times. This presentation will be available on the Rodale Institute website within about a week or two, so you will have access to that. All right, thank you to CJ, thanks Austin, thanks April, and thank you to Justin. We're gonna log out here.
Thank you guys.